Module 12, Mitigation Finance and the Energy Transition. If you follow the money in climate finance, the great majority of it flows to one place, cutting emissions and, above all, transforming how the world makes and uses energy. After the last module's hard truths about adaptation starvation, mitigation can feel like the easy child, the one the money likes. And in an important sense it is. But that ease comes with its own politics, its own failures, and its own hard questions for a developing country. This module is about where the big money goes, why it goes there so much more readily, and what happens when the flagship model for financing a country's energy transition runs into trouble. By the end of this module, you'll understand three things: why mitigation, especially clean energy, attracts private capital far more easily than adaptation ever could, where the money concentrates, in generation, grids, and beyond, and what just energy transition partnerships are, why they were meant to be a breakthrough, and why they've run into serious trouble. Let me begin by answering the question that hangs over from last module: why is mitigation so much easier to finance? You already have the tools to see it, because it's the exact mirror image of adaptation's three problems. Start with revenue, which we said was the heart of it. An adaptation project like a seawall generates no revenue. A mitigation project like a solar power plant does. It generates electricity, and electricity is sold to a utility, to a grid, to customers, through a contract, month after month, year after year. That contract is a stream of cash flowing back to whoever financed the plant. And a stream of cash is precisely what private finance exists to fund. A lender can lend against it, knowing the repayments will come from electricity sales. An equity investor can invest in it, expecting a share of the profits. The whole apparatus of finance, everything we've built up over these modules, debt and equity, capital stacks, blended structures, is designed to work with revenue-generating assets, and a clean power plant is exactly that. Now the second mirror. Adaptation was hard to measure. Mitigation has that clean, universal unit, a ton of carbon dioxide avoided, the same everywhere on Earth. That measurability is what makes carbon markets and results-based payments possible, and it lets investors and governments count and compare and target their money with a precision adaptation can never offer. And the third mirror. Adaptation was local, small, and particular. Mitigation, especially in energy, comes in big, standardized, repeatable projects. A solar farm in Vietnam looks a lot like a solar farm in Morocco or Chile. That sameness is a gift to large investors who can build expertise, spread risk across many similar deals, and deploy money at scale. A pension fund managing billions can't be bothered with 1,000 tiny community projects, but it can happily finance a fleet of near-identical utility-scale solar plants. So put those three together, revenue, measurability, and scale, and you understand why mitigation attracts private capital and adaptation doesn't. It's not that the world cares more about emissions than about drowning villages. It's that mitigation projects fit the shape of what finance is built to do, and adaptation projects don't. This is one of the deepest asymmetries in the whole field, and now you can explain it precisely, which most people in the room can't. There's one more advantage mitigation enjoys, and it's a big one: falling costs. Over the past decade and more, the price of solar panels and wind turbines has collapsed, and battery storage has followed. That means clean energy has moved from being an expensive thing that needed subsidy to being, in many places, simply the cheapest way to make electricity. When a technology becomes the low-cost option, you no longer have to persuade investors to fund it for the planet's sake. They fund it because it makes money. Adaptation has no equivalent tailwind. A seawall does not get dramatically cheaper every year, and even if it did, it still wouldn't sell anything. So mitigation has both the right shape for finance and a decade of falling costs pushing it along, while adaptation has neither. That's why the money keeps pooling on one side of the divide, and why correcting the imbalance takes deliberate public effort rather than waiting for the market to do it. If clean energy is so bankable, why does it need any public or climate finance at all? Shouldn't the private market just fund it on its own? In some places, increasingly, it does, and that's genuinely good news. The cost of solar and wind has fallen so far that in many markets they're now the cheapest power available, and private money flows in without much help. But in your world, the developing country context, several barriers still block that flow, and this is exactly where climate finance earns its keep. The barrier is usually not the technology, it's the risk, and specifically the risks we discussed back in the fundamentals. The risk that the local utility won't pay its bills, the risk that the currency will collapse and wreck the returns, the risk that a government will change the rules, the risk that lies simply in being a country investors don't know well. These risks push up the cost of capital, the return investors demand, so high that projects that would be cheap to finance in a rich country become unaffordable in a poor one. So climate finance in mitigation is mostly not about paying for the solar panels. It's about de-risking, the guarantees, the concessional first loss layers, the political risk insurance from modules 8 and 9 that bring the cost of capital down to where private money will flow. The public role is to make the bankable project actually get banked, in a place the market fears. Now let me show you where the big money concentrates, so you have a mental map. The largest single destination is energy, and within energy, first, generation, building the clean power itself, the solar farms, the wind farms, and increasingly the batteries that store their output. This is the most mature, most investable slice, and it's where private capital is most comfortable. But, and this is a point practitioners often miss, generation is not enough on its own, and the money is increasingly having to flow to the less glamorous parts of the system. The most important of these is the grid, the network of wires and substations that carries electricity from where it's made to where it's used. Here's the problem you should understand. You can build all the solar and wind farms you like, but if the grid can't absorb and move that power, they're useless. A grid built for a few big fossil fuel plants often can't handle lots of variable renewable power scattered across the country. So grids need massive investment to expand, to modernize, to become smart enough to balance supply and demand minute by minute. And grids are harder to finance privately than power plants, because a grid is often a public monopoly with murkier revenue and a heavier public good character. A little closer, in that respect, to the adaptation problem. Grid finance is one of the great bottlenecks of the energy transition, and it's getting more attention now precisely because the generation money is running ahead of the wires to carry it. Beyond electricity, mitigation money also flows to transport, the shift to electric vehicles and cleaner public transport, to industry, cleaning up steel, cement, and chemicals, and to the buildings and efficiency measures that cut how much energy we waste. For your context, the electricity system and its grid are usually the center of gravity, so that's where I've spent our time. Let me pause on one thing you, as a climate specialist, will care about, and that finance people often get wrong. Not all mitigation money is equally easy to raise, even within energy. A large solar farm selling power under a long contract is the easy case. But the harder, and in some ways more important, cases are the ones without that clean revenue, closing a coal plant early, for instance. Think about it. A coal plant is a revenue-generating asset. Shutting it down years before the end of its life means giving up that revenue, and someone has to be paid to accept that loss, the owner, the workers, the region. There's no product being sold there. You're paying to stop something, which looks, financially, a lot more like adaptation than like building a solar farm. This is why the money for building new clean energy has flowed far more readily than the money for retiring old dirty energy, even though both are essential to the transition. Keep that distinction sharp, because it's exactly where the flagship model we're about to discuss struggles most. Now let me bring us to the flagship model for financing a whole country's energy transition, and to its troubles, because this is where theory meets hard reality. The model is the Just Energy Transition Partnership, the JETP. Let me explain what it is, because it pulls together almost everything we've covered. A Just Energy Transition Partnership is a deal in which a group of wealthy countries and development banks come together to offer a developing country a large package of finance to help it move its energy system off coal and toward clean power, faster than it could on its own. The first and most famous was agreed with South Africa, announced at the Glasgow COP in 2021, with an initial headline figure of $8.5 billion pledged by a group of rich countries. More followed with Indonesia, with Vietnam, and others. The just in the name is crucial and comes straight from your world. The promise that the transition would be fair, that the coal workers and coal communities who lose their livelihoods would be supported, retrained, and not simply abandoned. On paper, the JETP was hailed as a breakthrough, a way to marshal serious money behind a whole country's transition, tailored to that country, with justice built in. That sounds like exactly the kind of large, coordinated finance the world keeps saying it needs. So why do you say they've run into trouble? Because when the packages were examined closely, several deep problems surfaced, and as a practitioner you should know them because they're the fault lines running through a lot of climate finance, not just JETPs. Let me give you the main ones. The first problem is the composition of the money. When countries looked at what was actually being offered, they found that the great majority of it was loans, not grants, much of it at or near commercial rates, with only a thin slice of grant money. And here's why that stings. A country being asked to undertake a costly, difficult transition, partly to help solve a global problem it did little to cause, is being offered mostly debt, which it will have to repay, deepening the very debt burden we discussed in Module 10. The headline figures sounded generous. The fine print was mostly loans. This became the central grievance, and it's the grants versus debt argument that runs through this whole course. The second problem is speed and complexity. The money has been slow to actually flow. Turning a headline pledge into dispersed finance for real projects has proven grindingly slow, tangled in negotiations, plans, and conditions, so that years after the announcements, only a fraction had moved. For people waiting on the ground, a pledge that doesn't disperse is not much comfort. The third problem is the politics of the transition itself. Moving a country off coal touches jobs, powerful state-owned utilities, energy security, and national sovereignty. Countries have pushed back on being told how fast to move by the same wealthy nations that built their own economies on fossil fuels for a century. And the just part, the support for affected workers and communities, has often turned out to be the least developed, least funded piece of the whole package, the thing most easily promised and least delivered. The fourth problem circles right back to what we just discussed. The hardest part of a JETP is paying to retire coal early and to support the workers and regions that depend on it, and that's precisely the part with no revenue attached, the part that looks like adaptation rather than a bankable power plant. So the leverage logic from Module 9, using a little public money to crowd in a lot of private money, works beautifully for the build new solar, half of a JETP, and barely works at all for the close old coal, protect the workers half. The result is that the money tends to pool where it's easy and stay scarce where it's hard, which is the same asymmetry we've seen again and again. So the JETPs are a fascinating, instructive case. The most ambitious attempt yet to finance whole country transitions, and a live demonstration of climate finance's hardest recurring problems: too much debt and too few grants, money that's slow to move, justice that's easier to name than to fund, and the easy money crowding into the profitable half while the hard, unprofitable half goes wanting. Whether the model can be fixed or gives way to something better is one of the open questions of the field, and one you may well work on directly. The lesson to carry is not that the JETP was a bad idea. It was a genuinely serious attempt at something the world needs, but that even the best designed package runs into the same immovable facts about what finance will and won't fund, and no amount of announcement can wish those facts away. Let me close by connecting mitigation back to the whole arc of the course. Mitigation is where the money is, and its relative ease of financing is genuinely good news for the climate: more clean energy, faster, at lower cost. But that same ease is a warning. Because mitigation attracts private money and adaptation doesn't, the system, left to itself, will always pour money into solar farms in investable middle-income countries and starve the sea walls and early warning systems of the poorest. The role of public climate finance, of the funds and MDBs and donors you work with, is partly to correct that pull, to de-risk mitigation where the market still fears to go, and to defend the space and money for adaptation that the market will never fund at all. Holding both of those in view at once is, in a sense, the whole job. So, to bring it together, mitigation, especially clean energy, attracts private capital far more easily than adaptation, for three mirror image reasons. It generates revenue that finance can lend and invest against. It's cleanly measurable in tons of carbon, and it comes in big, standardized, repeatable projects that suit large investors. The money concentrates in energy, first in generation, then increasingly in the grids that are becoming the great bottleneck, and beyond into transport, industry, and efficiency. In developing countries, the public role in mitigation is mostly de-risking, bringing the cost of capital down so private money will flow. And the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, the flagship model for financing whole country transitions, have run into serious trouble: too much debt and too little grant money, slow disbursement, and a promise of justice that's proven hard to fund, making them a sharp lesson in climate finance's deepest recurring problems. Next, we turn to a mechanism that sits right at the border of mitigation finance and market design, and that offers a developing country a way to actually sell its emission reductions to the world: carbon markets and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.